Right, let's start the meeting as we have a quite tight schedule for today. So good morning, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for a 2 days online UKTR Bootcamp. My name is Shell. I'm from the Timber Trade Federation. I will be your host for today and tomorrow. So I'm the panelist today. We have 4 or 5 speakers. Allow me to introduce them to you. Here we have Sam, Andy, and Sonia from Soil Association. And we have Philippa from Brooks Brother UK. And we will also be having Deanne and her colleagues from the UKTR Enforcement Team, or PSS. Deanne should be with us shortly. Right. Allow me to share with you my really quick presentation as an introduction. But before that, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box in Zoom to enter in your questions, and we will try to answer them either during the presentation or we will type up the answers. I don't think the chat function is available. It doesn't matter anything, please just type them in the Q&A box. Okay, right. So the purpose of today is really to go through with everybody the UKTR due diligence implementation aspect. Here, allow me to share with you a quick background. So this is where we are. The data is from the TTF members. A quick introduction. So as we all know, before Brexit, when we still were under the EU timber regulation, at least for TTF members, more than 87% of the timber product that we buy or we import are from the EU. So the non-EU product only account for about 14% overall. So this is in terms of quantity, volume. So right now, that percentage is increased from 14% to almost 4 times previously. So that means the biggest challenge in terms of due diligence for TTF members are those timber from the European Union. As you can see from this map here, majority of timber that bought by TTF members come from this region alone, main regions. In terms of the country, precisely which country do we import of timber from? Here's another breakdown. So you can see here, majority of timber is softwood from Sweden, Ireland, Finland, etc. And then plywood from China and Brazil. So what does that mean to us really is? Let's go back to this chart. Previously, when we think about illegal logging, we would assume most of illegal logging occur in the non-European tropical regions. It might still be true, but however, now the bulk of workload when it comes to gathering information due diligence is really shifted from those regions to European Union, because that is the bulk amount where our members at least get their timber from. And next, we have been working with our members, trying to providing trainings and guidance, etc. And here are some observations to share with you of how people are implementing their due diligence. So let's see what are the common packages or common components that we are seeing from a lot of UK operators. Number one, a lot of them are using supplier questionnaire. So they would send the questionnaire to their supplier asking for information about the species, country of harvest, availability of any supporting documentations, FAC claim, etc., etc., and the use of non-disclosure agreement so that their supplier feel more comfortable in terms of sharing and documentation, a supply chain map or a diagram or any sort of explanation about where the timber come from, and a summary report summarizing the 3 key and mandatory components of due diligence. Sorry, DD here stands for due diligence. The summary report, a lot of them are also breaking the summary report down into 2 separate sub-reports. One, a report on the country and species, and a separate one on the suppliers from that country. This is very common, especially sourcing timber, softwood from European Union, because there could be a lot of sawmills, for example, based in one country. In terms of template here, so a lot of operators are using the OPSF template, which I'm sure Diane will cover that in a moment. And some of them also use the TTF template. And very interestingly, a lot of them use their own template, which is really fascinating to see, as I'm sure our guest speaker Philippa today, and Amelia and Lee tomorrow, and Robbie tomorrow will be sharing with you a few of their own examples as well. To us, we really feel that it is this own template that really reflects understanding, implementation, and the core, the real system, the practical system that is behind companies' due diligence, because that is the thing that ensures the continuous and systematic running of due diligence. Next, let's see the common supporting documentations here. I provided some examples here for low-risk countries such as, I don't know, Germany or Sweden. So we are seeing a lot of them providing invoices and contract. So those can help to confirm the name of the supplier, the region of the supplier, the claims of any FAC or PFAC on the product, species sometimes, and also the quantity, of course. And then certificate of origin or packing list, bill of lading, or any other shipping and export documentations. Again, those can help to confirm country, claim of certification, quantity, species as well. And then a lot of them are providing supplier declarations on the list of species, especially if this is FAC certified product. Apparently, I'm sure Andy will add on and explain this later in more details. It is one of the FSC standard in terms of providing information on country and species. And next one, a really common one is, of course, FAC, PFAC certificate and evidence of conducting background and database check against FAC online database. Less common supporting documentations we are seeing from low-risk country include forest level documentation, unfortunately, because as we all understand, I'm sure it's still quite challenging for European, especially suppliers in many countries to provide the full transparency of their supply chain all the way back to the forest. And testing report, so that means sending a piece of product sample to the lab in the UK or there's another one in Germany to verify the species or to verify the actual origin where the timber is harvested. This is some members are using this, but this is really quite expensive, and we're not seeing this being used on a large scale at this moment. So each of those components here have its own weakness and strength, and I think Diane and also Sonia will be covering more in depth on the summary report, so how to present your due diligence process and findings properly today and tomorrow, and what are the major and common issues they are seeing when auditing and when checking those individual supporting documents and component. So I will leave the bulk of the content for Diane, Andy, and Sonia and Sam for later. So the aim of today and tomorrow is really so to help everybody to collaborate or understanding, interpretation, and approach when it comes to conducting due diligence, especially on those low-risk regions, some countries from European Union, for example, and product with certification. So hopefully by the end of tomorrow, there will be a better understanding of exactly what needs to be done and what documentation to be obtained when assessing and mitigating risk of those with those status. And we'll be learning from Deanne from OPSS, her own understanding and observations on common errors. And we will be learning guidance as well, very useful guidance from Deanne and her team during their enforcement activities of EUTR and UKTR. Number 4, we will be hearing from Sonia on the different approaches and component of reporting, and to see some good and bad examples of reporting. We will be hearing from DHH panel products, Brooks Brothers and TradeLink today and tomorrow on their own experiences of conducting due diligence under both EUTR and UKTR, and some good tips and errors to avoid. And lastly, we will be joined by Spot, BVReal and Open Timber Portal. They are all fantastic, very useful tools and free tools and resources available for helping both operators and suppliers in understanding and completing due diligence. So that is the aim of today and tomorrow. Agenda. So this is agenda for today. We will begin with a presentation by Andy, and then Deanne from OPSS. We will have a quick break at 12, hopefully, if we are on time. And then in the afternoon, Philippa will be joining us to share about her experience. And then we will be hearing more from Soil Association and a very quick summary and Q&A to end today. So I hope that is okay, and allow me to pass the presentation to Andy. Thank you. Andy, are you ready? I will stop sharing now. Okay.
Hey, thanks very much, Jan. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Allow me to just, I'm not great at multitasking, so bear with while I get the screen share away. Did I do that correctly? Yes, good, cool. Okay. Okay, there we are. Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm going to kind of give a little bit of the background. There's a number of you, I'm sure, on the call who'll know a lot of this or even heard it before, but we know there are a lot of new members of TDUK, people who are new operators because of the changes as a result of Brexit and transition to the UKTR. So we're going to start at first principles, discuss some more of the background. I'm Andy Grundy. I'm a senior certification manager at Soil Association Certification, and I've been working in the field of due diligence and legality for 7 or 8 years now. And I'll start out today by just giving an outline of who the Soil Association Certifications Forestry team are and what we do, and then a bit of background on illegal logging, what are the drivers and the impact of it, what does it cause. Discuss the different kinds of timber legality legislation that are out there. I'll go back to the origins of the EU timber regulation and its derivative UK timber regulation. And then we'll look at the requirements of those regulations in terms of a due diligence system, what that's composed of. I'll skim quite briefly over the areas because different parts of it will be focused on in more detail in subsequent presentations across the course of today and tomorrow. But it's fundamentally is made up of 3 parts: information gathering, risk assessment based on that information, and then mitigation of any risks that have been identified in the preceding 2 processes. Okay, so forestry team of Soil Association. We were a monitoring organisation for the EU timber regulation, and you'll find out precisely what that is in a later slide. And we are now a monitoring organisation for the UK timber regulation. That is approved as knowing what we're doing, and we have a due diligence system that people can utilise should they so wish. We've been responsible purchasing policy auditors for the Timber Trade Federation since its inception in 2013, and exclusive auditors to it for the last 5 years, I think, now. Our core work, the main work of our business, is FSC and PFC certification, forest management and chain of custody, and we work all over the world, 4,000 clients in now 66 countries. We certify something like 27 million hectares of forest around the world, and we have 50-odd staff, majority based here in Bristol, and we have 150 plus auditors scattered all over the world who are subcontracted to do our auditing work for us. So we have a lot of experience in different source areas and different supply chains related to timber and fibre products, and it gives us a good kind of overview and perspective of the global timber market. So timber legality legislation and the kind of origins of it are around the crises that of illegal logging that has occurred. I mean, I think if you go back to the 70s and 80s, most logging was illegal logging. The levels of corruption were so much higher. The World Bank estimates these are quite old figures. I would have thought the value is probably higher, but the volume is slightly less. Yeah, double-figure billions lost by governments in terms of lost tax revenue and associated income streams. As a result of illegal logging, it's a massive driver of deforestation, which is having a major impact on the climate emergency. What is illegal logging? It's any timber that's been harvested, transported, processed, bought or sold in violation of national or subnational laws. So it's not just about harvesting permits, it's about the whole process and the whole of the value chain and wherever illegality may exist. Illegal logging comes in kind of different forms, and its association with deforestation is often that selective illegal logging occurs of higher value species, and then fire is often used to clear the land and degrade it further, then permitting or encouraging conversion to agricultural uses, which are some of the usual suspects, and they are oil palm, beef, soy, cocoa, and mining, often illegal. And that land grabbing is often associated with political corruption at all kinds of levels within an organisation, be it the kind of blind eye we're seeing from the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil to local level bribing of officials. It has great impacts on a global scale through the tropical forests, and forests overall are a very important carbon store and sink. The soils under those forests, even more so in a lot of cases, are growing on peaty soils, and deforestation and conversion to agriculture will result in the drainage of those peaty soils, reducing huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere and impacting the climate emergency. There are local impacts on habitats and rainfall levels in the origin countries, and that soil loss can trigger landslides and obviously loss of important soils. Biodiversity associated with them, and the livelihoods of people who depend on those forests. For 1 billion people worldwide depend on forests for their livelihoods. To break up my drone, I try and make it as exciting as I can. We're going to have a short video now. So let's, here's about illegal logging across the border between Vietnam and Cambodia. So wish us luck on the technology.
Despite being exposed in early 2017, Vietnam persists in raiding neighboring Cambodia's protected forests for illegal timber. In 2017-18, the Environmental Investigation Agency, EIA, identified 3 areas in Cambodia where large volumes of timber are illegally felled and sent to neighboring Vietnam. In Virache National Park, a Vietnamese company struck a multi-million-dollar deal with a Cambodian border army unit to construct a road into the national park and steal timber. At the lower Say San 2 dam site, a massive complex of up to 60 sawmills processes logs which have been illegally felled in forests up to 20 kilometers away and then laundered through the dam site. Inside Phnom Prich Wildlife Sanctuary, cartels controlled by powerful logging barons strip timber from inside the protected area. Millions of dollars in bribes are paid to forest rangers, military, police, and media as trucks travel down a road of tolls to Vietnam. Vietnam has recently initialed a trade agreement with the European Union, a FLEGT VPA, to see Vietnamese timber licensed as legal in Europe. Yet Vietnamese officials continue to allow illegal timber into Vietnam, despite clear evidence of illegal harvest and export in Cambodia. The only current process for Vietnam to pass and enforce laws prohibiting illegal timber imports is the VPA. Vietnam must end the trade in illegal Cambodian timber to show their commitment to this.
Okay, thanks for listening out to that. So one example of illegal logging and the kind of corruption that's associated with it. So this drove the creation of varying sets of legislation in different countries. The EU timber regulation came into being in 2013. The US Lacey Act predates it, 2011, I believe, and the Australian Illegal Logging Act soon after. Japan's got one, but it's voluntary, which somehow defeats the object. South Korea's was introduced 4 years ago. The UK timber regulation, Brexit as a derivative of the EUTR, and recently announced the regulation. The EU timber regulation, its history, it's part of the Forest Law Enforcement's Governance Trade Action Plan launched in 2003 by the European Union to address issues of deforestation and illegal logging. And yeah, came into force in March 2013. The regulation prevents operators in Europe from placing illegally harvested products on the market, and legal timber being that's produced in compliance with the laws of the country where it's harvested. The regulation applies to a range of timber products from the scope a little later. The regulation itself defines the existence of two kind of levels of organisation within it. Monitoring organisations, which we are for the UK. And what we do is we've set up a kind of template due diligence system, which companies can approach and buy offers to use. We audit their use of it. We've been approved for that. But there's loads of free stuff available now on the website. And the TTF's toolkit, which Xiao's worked on quite extensively over the last few years, and it's a really, really good and kind of intuitive tool which will carry you through the completion of due diligence of potential product supply chain. So yeah, lots of tools out there. So we were a monitoring organisation for the EUTR as well, and the regulation also defines competent authorities for each EU country, and that is the enforcement body for the regulation. It varies in different countries. It falls under DEFRA in the UK, who've contracted it out to Bayes, whose one component part is the Office of Product Safety and Standards, and Deanne, one of our colleagues, will be talking to you in the next presentation about their role in the enforcement piece. Other countries are different. So in Italy, it's part of the police force. So scope, it's all wood products, finished or unfinished. Unprinted paper and pulp, but if it's printed, it's out of scope. Unusually, seats weren't included, whereas technically a set of furniture might be. So that, and charcoal is another strange omission because there's a lot of illegal logging associated with global charcoal production. The scope's been under review for a very long time. We've been expecting it to change. That's changed for years, but as yet, the flagged action plan that the EUTR is part of looks to address illegal timber coming into the sensitive markets covered by the regulation, but also reaches out to source countries to try and help them strengthen their legislative frameworks and improve enforcement. So basically dealing with both ends of the value chain that drives illegal logging. So to that end, the EU and the UK have signed voluntary partnership agreements with a range of source countries in order to help that and provide resources and legal support to develop those frameworks. Those partnership agreements ultimately end up with the issuing of a flagged license, Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade license, which essentially is a green lane then, and allows countries that have reached that status to avoid the purchasers having to go through due diligence and comply with the EUTR regulations. Only Indonesia has reached this stage so far, and it took them over a decade. For a long time, we've been saying Ghana and Vietnam are next on that list, but they both have specific challenges. But I've heard Ghana have made some gains recently. So yeah, a number of countries have signed VPA agreements, and others are in the negotiation phase, which precedes it. These is a list of the countries there, quite a lot in West Africa, a bit short in South America, and a few in Southeast Asia. It's a very complex process. VPA involves a whole range of stakeholders and bringing them back together, so it's a very, very complex process, very slow moving process. Okay, yeah, bit of a map of where they all sit. We've been involved in some of the work around VPAs. In Guyana, we've been doing some independent forest monitoring. This is basically testing some of the new legislation that's in place. So we've conducted a series of phases of audits out there to that legislation, providing feedback to this broad stakeholder groups that are developing additional and improved legislation. So let's move on to the obligations of what are defined as operators. An operator is someone that places on the market a piece of timber, and any illegally harvested timber or products derived from such timber are prohibited under Article 4 of the regulation. And operators must exercise due diligence in placing that product on the market, and to that end, they should have a due diligence system, details of which are set out in Article 6 of the regulation, and we'll come to that in a moment. So due diligence takes 3 steps, as I mentioned before: the collation of information, the assessment of risk based on that information, and mitigation of any risks that have been identified. It's worth pointing out, particularly in terms of link to enforcement in DAN or reinforcement data, you're only expected to have access to what publicly available information on risks of illegality, generic risks of illegality. Obviously, if there's apparent stuff within your the documentation you're receiving, clearly fraudulent volumes of sales invoices itself, or whatever, or evidence you're provided with, that's publicly available. But the generic risks of illegality in different places, you're expected to be aware of stuff that's publicly available as an operator. So let's look at the value chain. Understanding your supply chain is really, really important. And I think has been the most significant thing we've seen over the course of the regulation in place is companies getting to know their supply chains better, and mapping them out as part of your due diligence is really important. There's a template within the TDUK, almost call them a TTF. You might get a bit of a mixture. TDUK's toolkits. There's a template for you to use, but mapping it out so you know every stage and can evidence every stage of the supply chain is really important. So supply chain map might look like this. Here's a typical one for some flooring product, where you've got the plantation species going through local supply into a plywood mill to form the core, layers of some plywood and some tropical hardwood coming in another stage and being added to that plywood in order to make a flooring product. And then an agent is a key role there. There's a lot of agents in the supply chains, and as they take legal ownership, they are part of that supply chain, and evidence of it passing through their ownership should be gained. So the risks of illegality, as defined by that Article 6 I referred to previously in the regulation, it's assurance of compliance with applicable legislation, and you might use certification and other third-party verification schemes to help support that. You need to investigate the prevalence of illegal harvesting of a specific species of tree that you're buying the timber from, and illegal harvesting in a spatial sense, be it in the country of origin or the subnational region within that country, because a lot of them vary a lot from region to region. and including consideration of armed conflict. You need to examine whether there are sanctions on those countries by the UN or the EU, and indeed the UK. I don't know, there's a separate list, maybe Jan might know the answer to that. And you need to consider the complexity of those supply chains as well. The more complex the supply chain is, the more opportunity there is potentially for inaccuracies to occur, be they deliberate or not, and for material to be mixed within those supply chains. And that's commonly the issue, particularly with things coming from China, which is a kind of giant melting pot for commodities with final or near final products coming out. One of the really good information sources is the, it's not NAPCON anymore, they've renamed themselves Preferred by Nature. They received a load of money from the EU and the UK's Department for Development when it existed to develop the hub, which is a great resource and probably your first stop in terms of going and finding information on your supply chains. You can hover over a country and click on it, find risk assessments, find identification of the different risks that exist within those countries. The colour coding generally is green is good, red is bad in terms of the risk level. They come up with a scored risk level out of 100 for all countries. And yeah, it's generally the first port of call. What it looks at, the component parts of it, they look at risk across 5 different core areas: legal rights to harvest, the taxes and fees have been paid, trade and transport, and that kind of includes potential mixing, the harvesting regulations themselves and the rules that apply to work in the forest, and any third party and community rights which might be violated. Under those, there are 21 subcategories, which I won't read out, but all of those have been assessed for each of the risk assessments, and whether the country is generally compliant, and whether there is a risk of illegality is stated. So each country's risk assessment will say, you know, so many subcategories are low risk, so many subcategories are not applicable because odd ones aren't applicable in certain countries, and others are a specified risk. And it's those risks that are specified that you must find evidence to mitigate. So other information sources around sanctions. There's a couple of links here. We're going to share the presentation so you'll have access to these. So just scribble that crazy. There's a list of UN sanctions and EU sanctions. Obviously that would have been recently updated in Belarus. You've got general corruption levels of different countries, which are included in the assessment, published by Transparency International. They've got their corruption perceptions index. They score countries. And there's a very rough rule of thumb that tends to be applied. If the score is over 50, it's not corrupt. If it's under 50, it is, which is astonishingly blunt. And some countries that hover around 50 can be considered corrupt one time and not another. But you know, it's a useful tool to know whether you can trust state-derived paperwork and documents in relation to the products you're buying. Other information sources, there's a whole load here. It's essentially a list with links to be useful reference for you. Stuff related to rare species, assessing the risks for species. There's information on countries' work to improve their legislative processes, and reports that exist on illegal harvesting. Arbor Harbour is a useful, a useful resource for looking at the different names that timbers are known under. It's obviously local names in adjoining countries can be different, but it's actually the same species. All of the ones on this page are really likely to be reports and investigations into illegal logging. So anything that's on these websites is essentially publicly available information on potential legality risk source countries or processing countries within supply chains. Some more here. The Open Timber Portal is useful rankings for countries, mainly in West Africa, produced by World Resources Institute, and the NEPCON sourcing hub, link to that there. Obviously, organisations like the ITTO who are working to promote sustainable tropical timber, and there's a lot of useful updates in there. I mean, I looked at that actually this morning, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have recently conducted some audits of the forest concessions awarded in that country, and found that a lot of them were awarded illegally and are rescinding some of them, freezing some of them. So there's good updates on action being taken in some of them really high risk countries that could be affecting the risk profile. For example, there, if you were from there and the concession that your hasn't been identified as being awarded badly, that would be useful due diligence information for your assessment. Conflict timber, again, you've got to consider that. There's some links on the next slide about where you can find evidence about that, but it's not just national level, you're looking at national as well. There's often smaller conflicts along borders, and that's something. Regional variation is important. Is the timber you're sourcing coming from a region where conflict risk exists? And if you can evidence that it isn't coming from that region, then that's useful for you. Sanctioned individuals is another one as well. Directors of some companies have been connected to terrorism, for example, and income from those companies has been found to be terrorism. It's worth remembering that Googling company names, the name of the supplier and the word illegal after it can be a really useful way of searching out information across all of these, which shouldn't be neglected. So yeah, you're looking at a location, any connection between the timber and the conflict. Is it funding from the armed groups, for example? Whether the military and security forces are corrupt, getting money from it. An example being Myanmar, where we know that timber sales from Myanmar are supporting a corrupt regime that's oppressing its people, and the army are essentially taking backhanders of it. And whether there's violations of community rights and tenures. And the Heidelberg Institute and the World Bank have websites there with details annually updated, at least updated lists of the situation, lists of countries at different levels of risk. So the risk assessment based on this information, you need to make a kind of decision based on the information you've collected about your supply chain, and expressing that as a narrative to show you've clearly thought about the evidence, wonder what it meant, and made a logical decision based on that information, and it's reasoned, is really useful. It presents your due diligence in a way that allows an enforcement agent or an auditor to see your thinking. Essentially, it's like show you working and show your conclusion. If you identify a risk, there must be a mitigation in place for that risk. Obviously, one mitigation could be multiple risks, etc. So you can't identify a risk and then not do it. So some tips: use that supply chain map. Some of the best ones we see are supply chain maps with documents kind of embedded within them to evidence the links in the chain to transaction documents, for example. Checking those documents that they're complete, if they're missing, query them with your suppliers if you're not sure. The supply chain should go back to the source, and that source is the exact forest concession in high-risk countries. But the country of origin is enough if that country is confirmed as low risk. Thinking about the tools and the sources of information. How recent is the information you're looking at? You can't assume that a report that's 7 or 8 years old saying potential place is high risk has changed just because there are no more new reports. But equally, situations change and risk levels can change. So the date of things is important. Look at a range of sources. Don't forget the internet searches, as I've mentioned already, companies, locations, individuals, species, whatever. And accusations of illegality represent a risk. Is definitive proof of illegality is very hard to achieve. So the risk is. Another tip is documents are often faked. The example that's inserted there, you can see that 9 has been put in front of the 332. The line doesn't line up, and that's on harvesting volume permit. And you get obvious mistakes like that: numbers amended, broken lines, spelling inconsistencies, font changes. Worth pointing out PDF documents that we get now electronically. If they've had something kind of inserted into them, if you look at them, look at the properties of the PDF document, often it'll highlight that an extra text box is inserted. And validating documents is quite important as well. You can find out who the issuing authority are, and usually details are at the bottom of the document, harvesting permit. You can contact that authority, send them the document and say, is this real? Did you issue this? And then the certification and legality schemes, which my colleague Sam will be talking about more down the line, and how you ensure your information from those is robust. Again, yeah, all risks must be mitigated. So I just talked about document validation, verification checks, translations. You need to translate enough of a document to know what it's telling you. You don't need to send it off all for professional translation. You might have done that, might do that once, and then you know what key parts of that document mean, and you can do it yourself after that. Google Translate is a really useful tool. You don't have to translate a whole document. It's about volumes, it's about dates, it's about signatures, like that. Search for key terms, stamps and signatures is important, who signed it. Data analysis as well, volumes, conversion rates, mass balance. You know, is there the evidence of input logs that your suppliers sent for the sawmill sufficient to produce what you've purchased? Does everything balance up? We also have third-party verification as a mitigation tool. So FSC and PFC are not a green lane. Colleague Sam will go into that in greater detail later, and how to understand whether certification is real or not, or being used in a kind of fraudulent way. And there are assessments out there of certification on that one. There is a bit old. Another one is you'll visit your supplier, you'll look at the quality of the product that you're purchasing. Turn those visits, rather than just a handshaking exercise and looking at quality, turn them into an audit of that company. You can collect objective evidence, you can take photographs of logs, codes, you can ask them to trace a product through for you. Do something systematic, guide it, you choose what things to look at, what samples to look at. You can conduct your own first party audit. You can get your colleagues to do that, or contractors to do that as second party, or employ independent verification bodies to do those audits. But collecting information on them, keeping suppliers on their toes is really useful. Yeah, traceability is key. Registration numbers of vehicles, log tags, geolocated photos if you're going back to the forest. Stakeholder engagement is a mitigation that we don't see used very often, but can be really useful. Local communities and civil society groups can, you know, comment whether they think a certain company is involved in illegal logging in their areas or not. And there's often NGOs operating in high-risk areas. Product testing is another one. I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit more later, but there's different kinds of tests suitable to different situations. Species tests to tell whether it is what it says it is, and isotope tests becoming more and more relevant in terms of being able to locate where a product came from, or more accurately, where it didn't come from. With isotope tests, you send a sample with a claim of where it's supposed to come from, and then that can be confirmed or not in a number of cases, depending on the reference samples they've got. There's a project called the World Forest ID Project, which is being led by Kew Gardens, with lots of different partners, including FSC and the US Forest Service, and a competent authority here too. And you know, they're increasing the reference samples around the world against which samples can be compared in order to validate their origin. And obviously it's really useful because it actually takes you from the final product right back to the source tree, and if you've mapped a supply chain, it can confirm that that's right or not. So in summary, presentation and clarity, record your process, record the dates you did things, the times that the information was collected, present it neatly. If an enforcement body comes to visit you, a nice, neat and tidy due diligence assessment of a product supply chain will mean they are in your office for less time and less time poking around in your filing cabinets. If you give them the massive undifferentiated mass of paperwork, files to look at, they're going to be there all day picking through it. And if you can't mitigate the risk, you should not be placing the product on the market. So thank you very much. I think I've come in about 5 minutes early, which is usually not a bad thing on one of these. So thanks very much for your time, and apologies to those of you on the call who've heard all of that before. I shall stop sharing.
Right, thank you very much, Andy. I'm great. Deanne is here as well, but before Deanne starts, any questions may I ask anyone you have for Andy and for this first presentation? We will be sending out all the PPT slides to everybody at the end of the event, so in early next week. So please do not worry. And I noticed that we should really have enabled the chat box here, but unfortunately it is not on right now. So please feel free to use the Q&A box here to just type in what you wanted to raise, or any comments or questions or suggestions. Is that okay? Okay, no questions for Andy at this moment, I assume then. Right, let's move on to our next speaker, Deanne. So Deanne is from the OPSS and will be sharing with us Deanne's observations and guidance from her enforcement of the EUKTR in the UK. Thank you. Hello, Deanne, ready when you are. Right, okay, she has just left. We'll just wait a few minutes to see if Deanne will come back very soon. Andy, could you help me to just quickly check message Deanne to see if she's all right?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask her why she's run away.
I do have her slide here.
I'm sure it's just government Wi-Fi,
sure
or
yes,
some similar texter.
Thank you. Oh, and in the meantime, Fenzel has a question for you, Andy. Out of curiosity, does Soil Association offer certification services to company for their due diligence system?
I can take that while Andy is texting away, if that's all right. We do have a DDS scheme, yes. The way our due diligence scheme works is we supply companies with a due diligence system template, set of templates, and we audit them in their effective use of that. Then in our capacity as a monitoring organization for UKTR, we can issue a due diligence statement that explains what they've done and how they've worked to comply with UKTR. So yeah, that as part of that, we can also offer training in how to implement that DDS system effectively.
Thank you, Sam.
Hope that helps.
So just to embellish that a little bit while we're waiting for Deanne, we conduct annual audits. Deanne didn't have any sound, so she's restarting her computer to rejoin.
Okay.
Hopefully it'll work. So it's a turn it on and off again moment. Yeah, so we essentially, as part of the DDS, we come and audit you annually against your use of our templates, and might raise findings if you haven't followed the instructions properly. And you have to do it, and you get a statement at the end of it. It doesn't, I don't think, actually guarantees that you won't be investigated by the enforcement agency, but obviously it looks good to have used that system. But there's plenty of free tools out there as well, essentially do the same thing, including TDUK toolkit, which she's put a lot of work into in the last few years. And it's proper all singing, all dancing. It's kind of undercut us in the market, to be fair. But you don't get your annual audit from us. Although you will do if you're a TDUK member, who's an operator, because we come and knock on your door anyway. But that audit, the RPP audits, are only on a kind of single sample of your supply chain. So it isn't as robust as if you were using our DDS, when we'll actually look at, well, we'll look at all of it. We'll look at all of your DDS for all of your products. But we'll look at everything you've traded as an operator and pick samples ourselves rather than just the single sample we're doing through RPP.
Yeah,
and I'm padding. Go on.
Sorry, Andy. So later on, you will also be sharing with us like the checklist that you will be using from auditor's perspective during your investigation or assessment of operators' due diligence, don't you? Right?
Yeah. So that was that was on the agenda for today.
Yes.
Sonia will be presenting tomorrow morning on basically good examples of due diligence and poor examples of due diligence. So we felt it probably fitted better her presentation tomorrow morning to show, essentially just to show you the checklist, the audit checklist that we use as part of the RPP audit, which essentially comes in parallel to the due diligence toolkit that Xiao's created. Essentially a question: have they done this? Have they done that? And it runs through all the different elements of what a DDS has to have in it. So Sonia will run through that checklist tomorrow morning.
Yep.
And then talk about examples of where it's worked, where it hasn't. And
yes.
Post restart.
Hello, Diane. Can you hear us?
Oh, it doesn't look like Diane can hear us. Is this Zoom settings?
You may have to allow the audio on the bottom.
Good morning, Diane.
She's trying to send us a message. So she can't hear us. That's probably sound settings. We know that, but I'm going to text her anyway.
I think someone else had a similar sound issue, Philippa, right? And Leon as well.
Yeah, I had to allow where the sound button is, I had to allow it.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, Diane. Keep trying. Can you hear us? No? I don't think we can hear you either. Another way, Diane, I'm not sure, okay, if she can join via her mobile phone, and then I can share a slide from my end. Andy, do you want to tell Diane that?
I'm going to mute myself, try ringing her on the mobile.
Good, okay. Apologize, everybody, technical error for today. Okay, thank you, Lynn.
Diane did allow sound, okay. So that's strange. You can't hear us at all, can you, Diane? No. Curious.
If she's able to chat away, we might be able to hear her. But I don't think she's even said anything yet to check that.
Can we see the chat?
No, that has been enabled, disabled, unfortunately.
No, only Q&A.
This is the net map running on
I'm gonna
really sorry, everybody. Oh, we can hear her.
Ah.
Hello.
We can hear you. We can hear you. You just can't hear us. So you can give a presentation.
Yeah, I'll present then and put any questions in the Q&A.
Ace. Righto. Cool.
Which I won't be able to see while I'm presenting, but yeah. Okay. All right.
No, we can
just
visit
give
those
me
at the end.
give me the thumbs up when you want me to start.
I think.
Bye.
Go for it, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start now. Bye. Good morning. I'm reliably informed you can all hear me, even though I cannot hear you. So thank you for inviting me to the TTF Bootcamp. My name's Deanne Hughes. I'm an enforcement manager working for the Office of Product Safety and Standards. I'm responsible for enforcing the UK timber regulations, previously the EU timber regulations. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So hopefully you can all see my presentation. Great, I shall get on with it then. As I said, I'm Deanne Hughes and I work for the Office of Product Safety and Standards. Just a quick rundown of the topics I'm going to cover today. The regulations, looking at the different types of regulations that are in place, voluntary partnerships, flagged, looking at a few specific countries, Malaysia and Ukraine, the value of third-party certification, and then some of the issues we often see when looking at businesses' due diligence. So the regulations can be divided into two types, a demand side and a supply side timber regulation. The demand side regulation would be the UK timber regulations, previously known as the EU timber regulations. And they place an obligation on those businesses purchasing products. So the most of the work is done at the purchasing end. And a business placing a product on the market is required to carry out due diligence that comes to a conclusion of negligible risk of illegally harvested timber entering the country. And all UK importers importing from a third country must carry out due diligence in the UK. Supply side regulations are what's known as the FLEGT regulations, Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade. And that came from an action plan set up by the EU, which puts obligations more on the supply side of the timber supply chain. So those in producing countries that want to be able to issue a FLEG license for export to the UK must put in place certain procedures and processes and governance to demonstrate that timber from their country can be considered to be legally harvested. So if you're a UK importer, you need to obtain a FLEG license from the exporter that you're importing from, and then you must submit that FLEG license to OPSS for verification. Let's move on to the next slide. So how do you get to be able to issue a FLEG license? So as part of the FLEGT action plan, the EU devised voluntary partnership agreements, otherwise known as VPAs, and these are signed by a country with the EU. The UK doesn't sign any VPAs, that they will work towards putting in place governance and processes and systems in place to ensure timber coming from their country and entering their country from another third country will be legally harvested. Lots of countries have signed a VPA. This does not mean that they are authorised to issue a FLEG licence, and most of those countries are at very different stages in implementing their VPA. Some countries have signed a VPA and done absolutely nothing. Some countries are very diligently working towards becoming a FLEGT country. Some have, and they're required to implement a timber legality assurance scheme. Some have done this, but are still not authorised to issue a FLEG licence. I think the most important thing to remember about a VPA is it's not a mitigating measure. It's not something you can rely upon as part of your due diligence system. It's a separate regulation. It's not a mitigating action. So once the country signed a VPA and it has put in place a timber legality system and all the other processes that mean they can ensure they've got good governance, they will be authorised to issue a FLEG licence for products exported from their country to another country. So Flagged only covers timber coming from a country that has implemented its VPA fully. Currently, the only country that has done that is Indonesia. Timber with a flag license is considered to be legally harvested and out of scope of UKTR. And I think we said before, it must be submitted to OPSS for verification. And something else to remember, a flag license is only valid to the country of destination stated on the license. But we'll go into that a bit more later on. So I think we just said a flag license is only valid to the country of destination identified on the flag license. So if your product is going from Indonesia to the UK, but you actually land at a Belgian port, and on the flag license it says the destination is the UK, you will not be able to clear customs in that country. The Belgian competent authority cannot see licenses issued under the flagged the VPA agreement between the UK and Indonesia and vice versa. So if your product goes from Indonesia to Belgium, the country of destination is Belgium, and the product clears customs in Belgium, the flag license is then no longer useful as a customs clearing document. A flag license can only be used once, and it can only be used in the country of destination. If you then want your product to go on to the UK, the product then becomes in scope of UKTR. So you will need to do due diligence on that product if you want to then export it out of the EU and into the UK. And I assume vice versa, but I cannot comment on what EU requirements will be for obvious reasons. So you have exported products have been exported from Indonesia to Belgium, and then it's cleared customs, and you want to then import it into the UK. So although your flag license is now no longer a customs clearance document, it can form part of your due diligence. But you will need to be able to evidence that the competent authority in the country that the product went to directly from Indonesia has verified that license. So if you clear customs in the UK, we send out an email confirming that the license has been verified by us. So you will need something similar from the competent authority in Belgium to evidence that. So you're then doing full due diligence from the EU onwards. So there's a couple of things you need to think about. One, your flag license will cover legality of harvest because those are rules in Indonesia. However, it may not list all of the species, so you need to think about that. It may now be in a different volume because you've only bought half of the container or not all of the container. It can be used. It is third-party certification, so it can reduce your risk, and it can be used to evidence why your product would be low risk from the country of origin, i.e. Indonesia, but you will then have to risk assess the onward journey from the UK onwards. So if your product has gone into Belgium, not gone anywhere other than into a warehouse, and then you've bought the whole container, that's going to be quite an easy job. If your product has moved around, then you need to evidence all of that supply chain and do risk assessment. Okay, so this is a flag license. I don't know how clearly you can see this. I think it's probably quite small, but the slides will be shared, so you can use this as a reference in the future. So I'm just going to get a flag license issued under the UK Indonesian agreement looks exactly the same as a flag license issued under the EU Indonesian agreement, except that the flag license will have GB at the end of the license number, which is in box 3. I don't know if you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor where box 3 is. And the country of destination will be GB. So that's how you know you've got the right flag license. Flag licenses are only valid for 3 months. So if you have the wrong country of destination on your flag license and it then sits in a port where you try to sort this out, there is a good chance your flag license will then expire and you'll have another problem to solve. As I said, we can't verify license issued to Europe, and Europe can't verify license issued to the UK. And that was always the case even before we left the UK the EU. Member states could only verify their own licenses. And again, you must make sure you have the proper country of destination on there. Okay, so we were going to talk about Malaysia. So Malaysia has implemented a MyTLAS system, a Malaysian timber legality assurance scheme, but it has not been approved to the standard to issue flag licenses. And according to the EU website, they've ceased negotiations with Malaysia. Malaysia can be divided into 3 separate geographical areas when it comes to the risk of illegal logging, and they each have their own scoring under a risk of illegal logging, although they do all have the same corruption perception index score. In Malaysia is 48, so it hovers around the 50 mark, where we kind of change the risk level to slightly lower risk. Because of this scoring, FSC certification wouldn't mitigate the risk of corruptly issued documents, because FSC don't take account of corruption. So you need to think very carefully about what mitigating measures you are using from Malaysia. The 3 areas have very different risk systems, and I think if you were wanting to use your MyTLAS license as any sort of mitigating measure, you would need to have to look very carefully at your supply chain. You know, if you're saying it comes from a lower risk area of Malaysia, how are you going to prove that? That would be quite difficult. A lot of businesses have been presenting a MyTLAS license to us as proof of legality of harvest. This isn't enough. You have to do full due diligence. So I think that's probably it on that. And Ukraine is obviously, for obvious reasons, the hot topic. So prior to the current issues going on, Ukraine was already a very high risk country of origin. Just as the UK left the EU, the EU member states published a conclusion on Ukraine, which stated very clearly that because of the levels of corruption, neither government issued documents or third-party certification can be relied upon to prove legality of harvest. There are various site reports that identify government officials that are wanted on corruption charges. And at the time, we had numerous meetings between the expert panel group, which the UK was a member of, and the Ukrainian government. So even before the current situation, you had to pay attention to the EU conclusion, which also includes an annex with some suggestions for mitigating measures. You can find these on the EU Commission website, and they're also on the NetCon or Preferred by Nature website on the Ukraine risk assessment. So you still need to do that. Then more recently, you now need to take account of whether or not your timber is from a conflict area. Timber from Russia and Belarus are conflict timber, but there is no question over that, because the risk is that timber will be illegally harvested in Ukraine, smuggled over the border into Russia and Belarus, sold as Russian or Belarusian timber, and that money will be used to fund the conflict. So timber from Belarus and Russia is conflict timber, and I don't think anyone even wants it in their supply chains anyway, and it is going to be banned, or it has been banned. We're just waiting for confirmation of which commodity codes it covers. So when it comes to Ukraine, you will need to make sure you can evidence that your timber does not come from one of the conflict areas. You'll need to evidence that your documents were not issued by a corrupt official. You might want to think about when your documents for harvest were issued. Was it pre or post was it under the current regime or the previous regime? So third-party certification, always a favourite subject. So third-party certification has never been a green light for UKTR or EUTR, and as far as I can tell, it's unlikely to be. But it is a useful mitigating measure, but you need to understand the limitations of it. So I've put this, this phrase is, I think, in the EU Commission guidance and on the NEPCON Bird by Nature website, that businesses may rate credibly certified products as having negligible risk of being illegal, i.e. suitable for placing on the market with no further risk mitigating measures, provided that the rest of the information gathered and the replies to the risk assessment questions do not contradict such a conclusion. I have had people present me with a FSC certificate or a PEFC certificate and this statement for products coming from Ukraine, on the assumption that their FSC certification is enough. What that's saying is, in the first part of your risk assessment, you're asked if you have any third-party certification that proves legality of harvest. If in that question you answer yes, I have FSC certification, that's great. Your next question is that you ask yourself, is the risk of illegal harvesting in the country of origin, and you find 10 NGO reports about levels of illegal harvesting, and the country scores less than 50 out of 50 on a CPI, that contradicts that FSC certificate. The FSC certificate does not then allow you to not use further mitigating measures. I have done some limitations and some uses up there. I think FSC, third-party certificates say themselves that they do not take account of corruption when issued documents. I think for me, one of the most important things to remember is that you can keep your third-party certification even if you have major non-conformances. So you might be using a chain of custody certification to mitigate the risk of laundering, but then when you read the audit report, you may find that they couldn't identify some of their suppliers, or that some of their processes, there was evidence of mixing. That, if that is written in your audit report, that certification is not mitigating that risk because they've been found non-compliant for it. Auditing and third-party certification is voluntary, and it's a process of continual improvement. Committing an offence under UK law is very black and white. If your audit report for the certification that you are relying upon as a mitigating measure has a major non-compliance, it is no longer mitigating that risk. So you need to read the audit reports and you need to think about whether that certification really does mitigate the risk. There are lots of NGO reports that identify shortfallings in third-party certification. So you need to understand exactly what risk you're using it to mitigate and whether or not it really does mitigate that. So just, I think this is the last slide, just some common mistakes. All documents should be translated. If you can't tell us what a document says, then you can't tell me what value it is to your due diligence system. It could be a logging license. It could be a menu for a restaurant. Printing off a pre-produced risk assessment by, for example, Preferred by Nature or FSC is not the same as doing a risk assessment. It's not for me to come to a conclusion for you. It's for you to present your conclusion to us, and then we will decide if we agree with your conclusion. Only using one source to evidence risk when there are numerous risks available, and you've used the one source that says what you wanted to, but the other 10 sources contradict that risk, there's no point, because we will, if I'm coming to see you and you're buying products from Ukraine, before I come to see you, I'm going to Google illegal logging in Ukraine. So I'm going to be aware of all the other reports that contradict the one report that you've used because you haven't done full due diligence. And then I think we've probably already covered this. Due diligence should contain a narrative that explains how and why you have come to a conclusion of negligible risk. It's not for me to guess. You don't just present me with statements or evidence and then not explain how you've pulled them together and why it works. It's in your benefit to do that, because then I'll understand how you've come to that conclusion. If I can't understand how you've come to that conclusion, then I can't really agree with that conclusion. So not sure how we're going to do questions. I think there is a questions chat.
Deanne, I'm going to call you. I don't know if you can hear me.
Hi.
Hello, Deanne. Yes, so let's try this way. Super. Thank you very much, Deanne. We do have a few questions. The first one, so I'm looking at the Q&A box now. The first one, again, on Ukraine, I think you have covered it mostly. Any other mitigation measures perhaps you can recommend for UK operators to use when it comes to buying timber from Ukraine?
So it's very difficult for me to recommend mitigating measures because or specific ones, because it does very much depend on what you're buying and where you're buying it from. But in the, I'm a bit echoey, maybe I'll put myself on mute. Oh no, you need to hear me. No, I'm just going to put the phone away and speak to you. But the EU conclusion does list a number of options for mitigating measures. So I would suggest that you go there first. But I think if, as an example, if you want to mitigate the risk that your logging license was issued by a corrupt official, then you need to know who that official was that issued it, and you need to Google search on his name for any links to corruption. They were all named in the Earthsite report, so you would definitely need to be reading the Earthsite report and to help you identify all the risks.
Thank you very much, Deanne. So I guess the key point here is it might still be possible to mitigate risk of timber from Ukraine to low risk. However, it's just a matter of for the operators to making sure that all the key risk areas have been covered. And a lot of recommendations are given in this European position paper. We will provide a link to this paper at the end of this event. So hopefully that can provide a bit more guidance. Thank you, Deanne. A question from Fenso. So if a product goes from a tropical supplier via an EU country to the UK, is there a need for further risk assessment under UKTR?
So yes, the answer is yes. UKTR and EUTR are completely separate regulations. They are very similar, but you will need to carry out EUTR for entry into the EU. And then you will need to carry out due diligence under UKTR for entry into the UK. Obviously, you would then be relying on your European supplier to pass you all the relevant documents. But that's no different to when we were in the EU. You still had to rely on your supplier to supply you with the relevant documents to help you to carry out due diligence. There is no mutual recognition between EUTR or UKTR.
Thank you, Deanne. So Fenso, I hope that can help you with the question, but if not, please just keep typing your comments into the Q&A box, please. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Fenso has another one. Ghana seems to have made some progress in their FLAG-T process, but then I guess it's linked to the VPA's one, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's true. Ghana have made a lot of progress in developing their VPA towards being able to issue flagged. I'm not sure if they will be the next country to come on board, but it's likely that they will be. But until that is agreed, they will not. They're not flagged. Until they're allowed to issue flagged, you cannot rely on them. Well, I'm not saying you can't rely on them, but you can't use the VPA as a mitigating measure.
Perfect. Thank you, Deanne. And one from Simon. So if we cannot rely on FAC or PFAC reports, we have to visit the forest of the origin personally?
So that's not actually what I said. What you need to do is, rather than just accepting a certificate and checking that it's valid and it covers the product, you should also read the audit report. If the audit report doesn't have any non-compliances in it, or it might have a non-compliance that's not related to the risk you're mitigating, then it's still a useful mitigating measure. But there are some instances where I've seen FSC certification being used as a mitigating measure, And when I read the audit report, which we will do, the major non-compliances negated its usefulness as a mitigating measure. It's a voluntary service that business signs up for. You know, you can be non-conforming and maintain your certificate for certain subjects. So it's not that they can't be relied upon, but businesses need to read the audit report and make sure that they don't have non-compliances that negate its usefulness as a mitigating measure.
Thank you, Deanne. And sorry, Andy, you have your hand on.
Yeah, I was just going to add slightly to one. I think Ghana has, they've made great progress. I think the fact they're getting closer to it means that, some of the component parts of their VPA, some of the evidence that is gathered, and some of the civil society organisations involved could be used as mitigations for risk, as standalone pieces of evidence investigation. The fact they're progressing with the VPA as a generic statement that's not mitigating your risk. But that TLAS system that's being operated there now will have component parts within it that you could gather and use as evidence within it. And I think well done for Chris Beacom in Ghana, who's been working extremely hard on that for at least a decade, to my knowledge. And then I think, yes, and certification, Sam will be covering more of this later, but absolutely, it's a very strong system. It's some of the best mitigation you can have out there, but there are fundamental, differences between the way it works and the way legality compliance works. But Sam will talk more about that in the next presentation, which is after our little break.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Philippa.
Hi, so you said that obviously there's no mutual recognition between UKTR and EUTR, but do you think that there will ever be mutual recognition?
I don't think there's currently any political appetite for that.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you, Philippa. Any other questions from anyone? Please feel free to type them in the box. And I do also have two questions at the end. So one is for the timber that the UK operator import from European Union, especially the very low risk European countries like France, Germany. And given the fact that right now, still a lot of the European suppliers are very reluctant to provide documented evidence to prove the precise region of logging, what are the recommended evidence that or things that can be done that you could recommend UK operators to use as a way to verify the origin of their timber from those low-risk European countries?
I think firstly, we don't recommend mitigating measures. You don't, so for a country such as, if you're importing a product from a country such as Germany that would be considered low risk of illegal logging, low risk of corruption, you're not required to go back to the concession of harvest. You don't need to do that, but you are still required to prove legality of harvest. So that would be one of those countries where you might think what your FSC certification can be used for, but you are still required to prove legality of harvest. And if it's difficult because actually the EU countries need to be trained that they have to supply these documents. So I think the answer is, if they're not going to supply you those documents, then you can't buy from them. It's as simple as that. You have to prove legality of harvest. There may be uses for your FSC certificate or third-party certification in those circumstances, though.
Thank you. So, but what type of documentation would you recommend for people to use as a way to prove that the timber did indeed come from, say, Germany or France? Would invoice, bill of lading, this type of document be okay?
An invoice or a bill of lading proves that something came from Germany. It doesn't prove where the timber was harvested, and it doesn't prove legality of harvest. So you will still need to do those things.
Thank you, Dean. One question from Simon. Our parent company is based in Europe and carry out DD on our behalf. As long as we translate the documents and evidence they gather, is that enough to meet UKTR? Are we considered an entirely separate company for the purpose of due diligence?
So yes, you are. I only have jurisdiction over you. I have no jurisdiction over your parent company that's based in the EU, and I have no idea whether or not your parent company has been checked by the competent authority in that member state, and I have no idea to what degree the competent authority in that member state enforces EUTR. So you are considered to be a completely separate entity. Your parent company may pass on all the information that they use to do due diligence under EUTR, but you will then need to produce your own due diligence under UKTR. Now that may just be that you then have to evidence the link between yourselves and your parent company because they've done all of the work for you, but you will need to have your own due diligence. If I don't agree with the conclusion of negligible risk, you cannot say, well, my parent company in Italy did that, so it wasn't me. You will be the person that is non-compliant.
Thank you, Dean and Simon. I hope that clarifies it. If not, let us know. I know Philip is raising her hand, but before that, so Dean, I understand that because right now, as you said, we need to do a lot of more awareness raising and communication with our European partners. Might you be happy to support us in this? For example, doing a meeting or invite to a direct engagement or communication campaign with those European suppliers to explain to them the requirement.
Yes, I mean that you can already evidence to them what the requirement is by pointing them to our website or our guidance. But yes, if you can get together a large group of European suppliers, we would be happy to present on the requirements of UKTR. But what we're going through now is no different to what we went through when EUTR came into force. And I would have UK businesses refusing to sell another UK business where they found it from. It's the law. So if you can't get the documents required, you can't buy it. If you don't, as a supplier, understand that the businesses you're selling to have to comply with the law, then you will lose business.
Thank you. Philippa?
I was just going back to the point of the low-risk countries and what is required for the harvest. So I was wondering if a certificate of origin would be enough, or do you actually need the concession of harvest for low-risk countries?
So do I need
the certificate
so
of
for
origin?
a low-risk country of origin, you are not required to go back to the concession of harvest. However, you are still required to prove legality of harvest. So a certificate of origin, if the law in that country says that certificate of origin proves are the documents you need to cut down a tree, then that is what you need. I don't think it does. So whatever the documents are that prove legality of harvest in that country, those are the documents that you need. But you would want to think about how your FSC or how your third-party certification might help you with that.
Yes,
okay, it just seems to be a bit going back and forth in this, because you say we do not have to go back to the concession of harvest, but then we need the permits. So that seems like going back to the concession of harvest.
Yeah, it probably will result that you will have the concession of harvest, but it's not but the specific the UK timber regulations specifically state what your due diligence should consist of. So I can only repeat that. It's very clear. You only have to go down to the concession of harvest in a high-risk country of origin. I don't disagree with you that you have to get documents proving legality of harvest, then you will be able to tell me what the concession of harvest is.
Okay.
And I jump in on this one, kind of test Deanne's facial expression when I suggest something. If you go to the Germany timber risk assessment on the sourcing hub, it states that there is no specified risk and it's low risk for all 13 applicable subcategories, which include risk of illegality of harvest, and there are no suggested mitigation actions. So if you were sourcing from a sawmill in Germany that very clearly, and you could provide evidence, only sources their logs from within Germany, and you could evidence, you'd look that there was no risk of illegal harvesting in Germany, is that sufficient? Without actually having a harvesting permit, you've evidenced that if the timber comes from Germany, it's inherently low risk of illegality in harvest because the risk assessment says so.
So technically, no, because the guidance says a business may rate credibly certified products as having negligible risk of being illegal, i.e. suitable for placing in the market, with no further risk mitigation measures, not without doing full due diligence, with no further mitigating measures, provided that the rest of the information gathered doesn't contradict it. So you're filling out your risk assessment, you're doing your information gathering, you then start to do your risk assessment, and in the first question, third party that proves compliance with legality of harvest, you say, yes, I've got a third party certificate. You may then be able to evidence that what you've got to do is evidence that the timber came from within Germany. So you would still need to evidence that link between the forest and the sawmill. So you may use I can't give you a specific yes or no question because every supply chain is different, but you may look at your supply chain and it's a forest, a sawmill, and then you're buying sawn timber. So you've got a very uncomplicated supply chain. You're coming from a low risk country of origin. You may well be able to evidence the sale of the timber from the forest to the sawmill, in which case you may then say, well, actually, I can evidence that timber was definitely cut down in this forest. So then can I use my FSC certificate or my third party certification, other certification schemes are available, to evidence the legality of harvest. And that's when you need to go and look at your, so you you would need forest management certificate, so you're going to be going back to the forest anyway. So either way, and no matter how you do it, but then you need to be reading your FSC audit report and reading the FSC standard and saying this certification, although it doesn't mitigate corruption, they have requested all of these documents, so they've seen it, and there isn't a risk of corruption. So that is the document that I'm using.
Thank you, Deanne. Thank you, Andy. Few more questions coming in from William. What is the situation with Northern Ireland buying from a European-based supplier? Is due diligence needed?
So we are the competent authority responsible for enforcing EUTR in Northern Ireland. So if you are buying a product from a business in Germany and you are based in Northern Ireland, you are a trader. So you're not an operator, so due diligence is not required.
Thank you. But the Northern Ireland-based companies buying timber from the GB to Northern Ireland, in that case, will due diligence still be needed?
Yes, because you're going from UKTR to EUTR. Okay. So you will need to do due diligence under EUTR.
Right. One more from Hamza. In relation to testing, I assume, Hamza, you meant timber species or the origin testing. Is this only down to buyer and seller looking into the products, or is it a mandatory EUTR and UKTR requirement?
No, it's not a mandatory UKTR requirement or an EUTR requirement in Northern Ireland, but it is a useful mitigating action in some standards, in some circumstances, and there are some circumstances where it's really the only acceptable mitigating measure, which I would say is probably oak furniture coming out of China.
Okay, that is one scenario where you think testing has to be done as a valid mitigation. Okay, for oak products from China, testing is needed. Okay, one from Eve, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Where can we have the due diligence standard?
I don't really know what you mean. There isn't a due diligence standard because the regulation clearly states exactly what your due diligence should consist of.
I assume it is down to interpretation, understanding of the actual risks involved with that particular product supply chain, isn't it? It's really down to individual.
I don't think it's down to individual. I don't agree that it's subjective, because I think if you Google illegal log in Ukraine and you fail to identify the risks, then then you've done that deliberately. You can't fail to identify the risks. And if you provide a narrative explaining how and why you've come to that conclusion, then if that narrative doesn't make sense when you're writing it, then you've done something wrong in your risk assessment.
Okay, if that answers your question, hopefully. If not, let us know. And from Jane, more question. What level of collaboration or cooperation does OPSS have with the European competent authorities?
So both regulations are enforced independently of each other.
Are there any communication between you and the European competent authorities at all as a way to?
No, they're completely separate regimes, so they're enforced independently of each other.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Deanne. Any more questions for Deanne? Looks so good. Oh, okay. So I have one more, Deanne. How about Myanmar? Timber from Myanmar. What is the latest UK position?
So the UK position hasn't changed since the EU conclusion was announced, and if anything, since the coup, the risks from Myanmar have got worse. In between the two dictatorships, there were some attempts made to change the regulations. However, none of those actually happened or were put into place. So the situation has not changed, other than it has deteriorated.
So that means really we can't really buy timber either directly or indirectly from Myanmar, because that will not satisfy and meet UKTR in terms of legality. Is that right?
I have no power to stop you buying timber from Myanmar. I would say I have never seen a compliant due diligence system for teak or any timber from Myanmar, either bought directly or indirectly.
Okay, so if anyone did really come up with a fantastic due diligence, maybe we can, it's best to discuss that with you first, isn't it? So that you can, yeah, discuss the validity and credibility of that due diligence process for Myanmar.
So yes, I think as a rule of thumb, we don't interrogate due diligence for businesses prior to them making imports, because that would mean we would be acting as a consultant, and that's not our role. But yes, if you did think you had found a way to prove that a dictatorship wasn't being held in power by the profits of selling teak to the super yachting industry, I would be very interested to see it, and I would look at it for you.
Thank you very much, Deanne. Any last questions for Deanne? Okay, that's so good. Right. Thank you, Deanne, for your presentation. We will be sharing your slide over to all the participants, and if we did get any further questions, I will forward them to you, if that is okay, for any further clarifications that you could provide to them.
Yep, no problem. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Right, thank you, everyone. So now is break time. We 10 minutes overrun, so we will try to come back at 12:20 for 10 minutes break. Thank you very much. See you soon. Hello, Sam. Are you presenting for the next session?
I think it's Philippa
Okay,
next.
Andy. Okay. Just 2 more minutes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Philippa.
Okay.
Very good. No worries.
Technical difficulties today.
Yeah. So Philippa, I'm going to start the screen now, but if you want to move your slide, just let me know, yeah? And also with
Yeah.
the questions, just let me know when you want to release the questions. Or just
Okay.
wait for 2 more minutes to,
No, not a problem.
no problem. Okay.
I
Oh,
think a question just came up.
no, I'm just
But yeah,
testing.
I mean,
Just
you
testing.
can release them whenever. I don't know, maybe in the end of the presentation.
Yep. Okay. Okay, 1 minute to the end of the break. Right. I hope everybody has now come back from the break. If you do, thank you very much for rejoining us. So this afternoon, we will have Philippa from Brooks joining us to share a little bit about her own experience with due diligence and any good tips and examples. We will then be joined again by Soil Association, Sam, Sonia, and Andy, with a bit more from their auditor's perspective, what are expected of UK operators, checklist, and auditing, and reporting examples and practices. So let me hand it over to Philippa. Philippa, ready when you are.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak. Unfortunately, I have some technical difficulties, so Jao will be changing the slides as we go, but feel free to ask questions. Yep, so this is my own experience. Obviously, we already touched on risk assessments and risk mitigation, so I will not go too deep into that, but keep in mind that that is the main purpose of the due diligence. So if you see the next slide. So it's very important you do thorough research on the regulation, not just of the UK, but of the country that you are importing from. Sometimes it is difficult to get this information. I'm sure you have found some countries there's not much out there of what different documentation you would have, different risk levels. I think an example is Uruguay on NEPCON or sorry, preferred by nature. On FSC, there's not any risk assessments or any kind of analysis of what documents you need, anything like that. So in those cases, you kind of have to do a bit more thorough research, try different sources. These are the ones that I find helpful for myself. If you go to the TTF website, you can see there's different things on the toolkit, Chinese plywood, the CPR regulation, the UKTR regulation. It's very helpful. All of these are helpful. I think I forgot BV Rio, obviously that's good as well. UN FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization. They also have some good information there. If you get to the next slide. So this is an example. I use the Timber Trade Portal a lot because I find them very helpful. They have country contacts, as you see, how the timber sector is, legal frameworks. You can see different legal instruments that are used in the country, the different regulations, and this part here, the key documents, is what I use a lot. And it tells you see on the left-hand side what they are, in the middle, more details, and then which government entity gives out these permits, etc. So yeah, I find this very, very helpful. There's on the Timber Trade Portal itself, there's this link that you can go to other platforms. So it'll take you directly there. And if you press on all platforms, it gives you a full list of different issues. This is on the website. Sorry, this is not in the PowerPoint presentation. But if you go, it literally just type Timber Trade Portal on Google and it will come up straight away. Will be the first thing that will come up. And then when you press on all platforms, there's a full list of different sources that you can use. The next slide, please. Sorry. I think I'm frozen.
Yeah, I don't think it's you, Philip, because I can still hear you and you're moving. I think it's Xiao's moving.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. Hello.
So yeah,
Please continue.
That's okay. So the Timberlex is one of the other sources that you can find in the Timber Trade Portal. They are very, very good. So they have a full list as well of regulations. They can give you a PowerPoint, a PDF version, and it gives you different sources to click on. So that's when you get the PowerPoint, you can click on that link there and it will take you there. But they have information such as the country's government agencies, the different agencies that grant permits, such as harvesting or the operation permits. There's different legal instruments in the legal framework of the country profile, forest area, and annual forest change, which is quite a good thing for your risk assessment to put in, and forest management and land tenure rights. So it will tell you the framework of the legal governance of the country, all the things that you need to know for your risk assessment. Next slide, please. So yeah, we already had people speaking from the Soil Association and the OPSS, but so yeah, just a slide on enforcement. Obviously, being a member of the Timber Trade Federation, you will get an annual review by the Soil Association where they ask you for a sample of your due diligence. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And the government obviously can at any point come to your office and ask to see your records. Obviously, you need to keep a 5-year record of all the due diligence that you've done, mitigating factors, all of that. So yeah, how can you comply with the regulation? We talked about the risk assessment and mitigation, but you need to gather information on the species, the quantity that you're importing, the supplier, the country of harvest, and the compliance with the regulation of their countries, which is where the sources I gave you before will be very helpful, as we saw in gathering this information. I find that it's better for you to do research before you contact the supplier, because then if you know the documents that you are required in a certain country, it'll be easier to request that, and then they know what you're talking about, rather than just saying, can you give me a harvest permit, and then they call it something else. It's just easy if you do your research beforehand. It makes the conversation a little bit easier with the supplier. And usually, if you have a long relationship with them, they already know what they have to give you, so it will be easier. Obviously, you need to make sure that what you're importing is not illegal, not contributing to the deforestation. You can mitigate risks in many ways, but one I found really handy to contact NGOs, do third-party auditing, so you can hire, if you can't go to do a site visit yourself, you can hire someone in the country to go. Obviously during COVID, a lot of us had to do that. We couldn't go ourselves, so we had to hire someone. And yeah, so establishing the documentation required by country of origin is important. For example, in Malaysia, they don't call it transport slip, they call it removal pass. And then the removal passes will have the number of the harvesting permit in the removal pass itself, because they will not be issued unless you have a harvesting permit. Go to the next slide. So this is how you can look at the risk factor of the countries. So obviously red is high risk country and green is low risk country. You can see there that Canada and US quite low risk. And yeah, obviously the Congo Basin is high risk. I'm sure we all know this. So yeah, when dealing with high risk countries, obviously corruption is a main thing, because sometimes, for example, government officials might be corrupt. They might grant concessions in terms of like if they get paid for it, they can turn a blind eye to regulation. Sometimes the certification might not be valid. There's some countries that are known for falsifying certification. So yeah, the reliability of some documentation. So some countries, they have the taxes are self-declaratory, so can you really trust that they're paying their taxes? Illegal logging activities may happen due to conflict in the country. Sometimes third-party rights or indigenous rights are not respected. So yeah, so different things that you need to look at, and they're important, especially in high-risk countries, because instability is a factor in trading illegal logging materials.
Oops, I think, okay, you are back. Continue, please, Philippa.
Oh, you're back.
Continue.
Yes, you can put the next slide, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
So this goes for low risk countries, but also goes for high risk countries, because when obviously check everything that you are trying to buy, how do you know it's actually from that country that it's coming from? You need to check that the species, are the species actually available in that country? That's a very important thing you need to see. And how is the availability? Are they known to trade a certain species for another? Obviously, some of these things you know by trade, you know by experience and example, but you always need to check, even if it's low risk, because we mentioned before with the OPSS, you still need to do the checks. Are they, for example, are they a country nearby a country of conflict? Is there a chance that they can come from that country? You know, there's a lot of countries near Russia.
Yeah.
Is the birch Russian? Is it Latvian? Who knows? We need to know. That's
Common sense issues, yes.
Yeah, they need to think about these things as well. They might be quite obvious, but they are all things that you need to include in your mitigation. And that's the thing as well. Always write down all the steps that you take. Don't leave things out, because they don't know that you've looked into this. Yeah. They're not going to guess. Just obviously check. But I find with low risk countries, it's a lot easier to get information and to trace it back to the forest of origin.
Okay. Next.
Yes, please. Okay, so yeah, so the tips. Obviously, always research current affairs, the timber regulation, research on the company. So spot who you would hear from. They have lots of reports on companies that you can go and look at. Keep asking questions and keep asking for documentation. If you don't feel like it's enough, if you can't, I think the main rule for me is if I can't finish my risk assessment, it means I don't have enough information. So you need to keep asking questions. Maybe do some species testing, look at satellite imagery, maps, so where the mill is, where the forest is. the trajectory that it takes. Is there any conflict in between that trajectory? Something that might happen to the timber on the way. Global Forest Watch data. You can look at the deforestation rates. Obviously, I already talked about the Timber Trade Portal. Open Timber Portal is very good, so you can look at different companies. They upload their own documents there from the Congo Basin, places like the Ivory Coast, Cameroon, stuff like that. It's all there. Contact NGOs, but sometimes they might not have NGOs in the country of origin. But I know the Client Earth does quite a lot of work in countries like the Ivory Coast. They actually have a database in their website that you can access. Translating documents to understand the content. And to make it easier for yourself, you can ask your supplier to sign an NDA or terms and conditions agreement before you enter into a contract with them. I find that if they sign something, they usually give you things. So yeah, this is the what you might see when you go to Global Forest Watch. And then usually in green is the forest cover. You can see there's not much there, unfortunately. In pink is cover loss. And gain, you cannot see much gain in blue. Yeah, this is, and you can change the years. You can try to see if there's been improvement. So if you go to this website, it's just called Global Forest Watch. It can help you with your risk assessment. And yeah, avoid relying on documentation alone. You don't know if it's falsified or if it's. There's many issues you can get with documentation. So obviously gather everything you need, but you can ask. Sometimes some NGOs will verify the signature for you, and or you can contact the government officials to see if they actually, if you trust the government officials of that certain country, to see if they have actually given that permit out. Obviously, do not just accept documentation as face value. You need to do site visits if you can, or hire an auditor to go there, do some species testing. Certification as well, don't just rely on them having FSC or PFC or LB. You have to still trace everything and mitigate any risks that you find. And yeah, so avoid trying to source from countries without certification that are in high-risk countries, but sometimes it's not possible. So, well, some countries have OLB, but they won't have any form of FSC or PFC. And that's also something to look at. So if someone in the Ivory Coast tells you they have FSC, that's probably unlikely. So it's just something to look at. And conflict timber, obviously avoid buying timber from places with conflict. And that is it. I hope that was helpful. There's some questions.
Yes, a question from Hamza, which is also a question I really wanted to ask. You used a lot of very useful references, and you mentioned about understanding the documentation, the content of the documentation. So how do you translate it, and how do you show that you have tried your best to understand the content of a foreign document?
So I normally will translate most of the document if I think it's relevant, and I have Google Translate on my phone, and I will just scan the whole document and look through it. Thankfully, so the countries I deal with mostly are in French or Portuguese, so I can understand it myself. So I will just put a note on the PowerPoint or the PDF or on the document itself, and I will write everything that I can read and understand and translate. But you need to make a note on the document. Like Diane said, you can't expect them to know that you've translated it. Everything has to be noted down. But I think the only way is Google Translate at the moment. Isn't that the only way? I don't really know any other way. I've tried translating services and they are very costly, and that's not really something that a business can do all the time.
Do you
so I find Google Translate the best.
Sorry. Do you translate everything or just the key component?
Well, if Google Translate has an option that you can scan the whole document and translate it. So if you can translate the whole thing, why not? Then it was easy for you to just go and read it. But if you know where, but how would you know where the main points are? That's my only question.
Okay. That's very useful, and especially as you know that you do need to somewhere note it down in your report that you've done this translation. You've tried to understand the content. Yep. Okay. Thank you. And Sam, I saw you had your hand up. Any questions for Philippa?
I was going to mention exactly the same thing that Philippa mentioned about Google Translate. I've got a Google phone, so I can use the Google app, which just has an automatic translate feature. You just point your camera at the document and it live translates over the top of the document. You can get it on iPhones as well. So that is the most useful thing that we use all the time. Like Philippa says, you can obviously get technical translation services, which are expensive. I'm sure there's other online services available where you can upload documents and have them translated, but Google is the most straightforward for me.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. And Philippa, I also have some questions for you, if I may. So I know that you've only been doing this whole due diligence thing for the past 2 years, if not longer. So can I ask, what is the biggest difficult thing that you found so far with due diligence?
I find it difficult sometimes to get information because a lot of countries don't want to share their supply chain. They're scared that we will either steal their business or share private information. So if you need to assure them that, I'm the compliance person, obviously I am connected to the business, but my main priority is to make sure that the timber is legal and verifiable, which is why you need to have someone separate really doing this role. Obviously, sometimes it's difficult in small companies and you can't do that. But if you have to try to have a relationship with the supplier and try to explain that we do want their business, we're not going to steal their business, it's just a matter of our own safety and not placing illegal products in the market. And sometimes I find it hard gathering information in certain countries, like I said before, but Uruguay and stuff, those are quite low risk, but you still need to trace it back. And when there's no information out there, it can be difficult to do your job.
So just keep communicating, keep talking with the supplier, I guess, a lot of times.
Yeah.
And the second question, so now you have a lot of documentation provided to you by your supplier. How do you then present exactly what you've done to the auditing body or to Diane and her team during our enforcement? I hope that makes sense.
So because we have our own system in place, and one of them is a risk assessment, but we also have one where we tick what documents we have and then we put them in order, and then we separate them by either forest level, third-party rights. So we separate them all into different categories, and then we will talk about those different categories and refer to the documents in our risk assessment and in the other form that we have, that we tick all the necessary boxes. And then our shipping team has to check that that is all in place every time the new shipment comes in. So there's communication at all times. Even in our system, we have banned lists. So if something is banned, it can't be ordered. Every time a PO is made, we get notified. So there's lots of different checks in place to make sure that we are aware of everything that's happening at all times.
So that's not only communicating with outsiders, it's also internal between departments communications. Yeah, sometimes is very key. Okay, right.
But we're quite big companies, so it's a bit different to small. Obviously, smaller companies cannot do that. And I've been in a smaller company. I know it's very difficult to do that alone.
Yeah, it is. That is why we try to provide as much help as the Timber Trade Federation as we can to those smaller companies, especially. One last question from me, Philippa. Certification. I know this morning Andy and Deanne, both of them mentioned a lot of times about the role of FSC, PFSC. So so how do you use FSC or PFSC during your own work, especially, for example, in certain countries where you cannot get FSC or PFSC certified products from those countries? What would you do?
Well, you try to get, have you heard of OLB certification? So that is quite similar as well. So you would try to look for that instead, because when it's a high risk country, we try not to buy from them unless they have some sort of verifiable certification. But otherwise you can go and visit or send an auditor there to check someone that will be experienced going to that country. But it's a bit difficult. Like in Ivory Coast, they will have stamps on the trees with the coordinates of the logs, and unless you know everything that you're looking for, it will be very difficult. So OLB would be the best choice to go for instead of non-certified.
Okay.
That's what I would say. So,
yeah, sorry. So how about for a very low risk country? So if you purchased a certified product from a very low risk country, would you still go to the same set of checks on those certified products?
We'll still go back to the forest of origin, like it was said before, but you need to check more if the claim is passed through the chain. So if it's FSC 100, all the documentation has to say that from the forest of origin to yourself. If one of them does not, then it breaks the chain. So you have to make sure that the chain is continued.
Okay. Thank you, Philippa. So that is checks on certified or non-certified, whatever, but same set of checks is conducted. That's
what the OPSS keeps saying. So that's all we have to do, I guess.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of work. Yes. We have a question. A question from William. Can you give some information on field visit or factory visit? We buy plywood manufactured in China with the face and back veneers imported to China from South America. Are we expected to visit the forest source in South America? So what would you do if in that scenario, Philippa?
We'll hire someone to go there if you can't go, because that's, yeah. Because especially plywood, you have to comply with the construction products regulation, and you have to do the ITT, all the species testing, the bonds testing, everything. So then you have to do your own testing on it. It's very complicated to get plywood from China, and especially because, yes, it's a low risk country of origin, but then it passes through China, so the manufacturing is high risk because you don't know if they're mixing other things with it.
Yeah, so
sending someone to the field.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry,
Sam,
you were saying?
Sorry, so Sam putting up his hand.
Very similar to how Philippa put it. I think that mitigation should follow risks identified. So you should make sure, it's very hard to talk about specific situations because the mitigation action should always attempt to mitigate a risk that you've identified. So like Philippa said, there's going to be risk of origin of material, and then there's also risk in the supply chain. So any field visits and audits and things that you do need to address some element of that risk that you've identified in your risk assessment. So you don't want to just do a field visit as a tick box. You need to be doing it for the right reasons and make sure that it addresses those risks as part of the audit.
Thank you, Sam. So I guess in another word, that literally means field visit is okay, but it can only help to mitigate the risk that timber come from the illegal part of Southern America or illegal forest plantation in that region, and cannot mitigate risk of mixing during the manufacturing and transportation process within China. And to some extent, perhaps that is the bigger size of the risk here, because some countries in South America, the actual risk of illegal logging could be quite low. So the higher risk here is actually with the China end of things. So mixing. So that is perhaps something that need to be taken care of. Yes.
Yeah, I'd agree. Again, a field visit, or sorry, a field audit could be an appropriate mitigation there, but it would need to address those risks as they occur. So you wouldn't want to address the risk of mixing in the supply chain in China by visiting the forest, for example.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Philippa. William, I hope that answers the question. But if not, do let us know. Okay, right. Thank you so much. Oh, any other questions we have for Philippa? Well done. Thank you. Thank you so much, Philippa. I know that you have been fantastic in doing this, because you have only be yourself doing due diligence and talking to suppliers. So massive amount of work putting into this. And thanks so much for sharing with us all that tips and things to avoid. Much appreciated. Thank you, Philippa. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, stay here. Don't go. Let's now move on.
I am here, just going to turn off.
Let's now move on to Soil Association again. So Sam will be sharing with us about the role of certification and practical tips of sourcing from low-risk countries and a little bit about reporting. Thank you, Sam. Over to you.
Thank you, Zhao, and thank you everybody for sticking around into the early afternoon. I'm going to presume that you can all hear me and carry on. So just as a quick introduction, my name's Sam Shaw. I'm a certification manager in the forestry team here at Soil Association. I am also an FSC and PEFC chain of custody auditor, and I also audit for some of our other schemes, including DDS and RPP with TDUK. So today I'm going to look, as Zhao said, at certification. I'm going to cover, you kind of recap and expand on a lot of the things that people have mentioned already. So I'll talk about the two main schemes, the types of certification within them, how legality, as an example of one of the aspects that certification covers, is implemented in those standards. I will talk about due diligence in respect of certified products, how to actually evaluate whether a product is certified, and some of the strengths and weaknesses. I've also tacked on a couple of slides to talk about high risk versus low risk country sourcing, and one other which I can't remember right now, but we'll get to it. So we have our two main voluntary certification schemes for forest-based materials worldwide. There's FSC and PEFC. They are both very similar in what they want to achieve, and actually there's, you can't really say whether one is better or worse when it comes to legality, or what they achieve in the forest and the supply chain. They do come from two different backgrounds. So FSC came from very much an environmental and social background. PEFC is more economic, but like I said, both the standards try and achieve the same thing. The fact that they are voluntary means that any forest owner or processor doesn't have to be certified to provide timber products, and they also, if they do hold certification, doesn't mean that that product is actually certified when they sell it. So we'll get to that. The way that these schemes are implemented is through third-party certification bodies. So that's what Soil Association certification is. We operate, we are accredited, by an accreditation body. In the case of FSC, that's ASI. For PEFC, because we're based in the UK, that is UCAS. They accredit us to go and audit companies against the FSC and PEFC standards that apply to those companies. And we can then issue those companies with certificates to apply to their products. It is a product level certification. So it's a third-party certification. It's the highest level of assurance for timber certification that you can get currently. So at a basic level, the schemes are split into two types of certificate. You have a forest management certificate and chain of custody certificates. The material that goes into a certified product needs to originate from a certified forest. And then each company that takes possession of, and that's legal possession, of that material, whether they process it or just trade it on, needs to hold a chain of custody certification to continue that chain through, so that you end up with a certified final product at the end. I'll refer to forest management as FM and chain of custody as COC probably, so just to cover those acronyms quickly. So like I said, there's two slightly different approaches to the schemes. This comes in a way from how they were founded. FSC has identified 10 principles and criteria that they will apply to forest management all around the world. Those principles and criteria are then adapted down to the country level to determine the national standards for responsible forest management in that country. PEFC works slightly differently. It's an endorsement scheme. So you start off with a national standard for responsible management of forestry. In the UK, that's UKWAS, UK Woodland Assurance Standard. And that national scheme or national standard is then assessed against PEFC's meta standard, so PEFC Sustainable Forest Management Requirements. And if it meets those requirements, and it may be over and above, then it's endorsed as part of the PEFC scheme and can supply certified timber into the supply chain. So how are the legal requirements covered by these two documents that I've just talked about? So for FSC, they have a legal instrument called the Policy for Association. This is a contract that they hold with all of their certificate holders. And one of the core values is illegal logging or the trade in illegal wood or forest products. So everybody who wants to hold an FSC certificate will sign up to this Policy for Association. It's also reflected as Principle 1 in the principles and criteria for forest stewardship. And I'm going to jump ahead to show how this is enacted in the UK, for example. So you have Principle 1, goes down to Criterion 1.1, and there will be multiple criteria under that principle, where this particular one is talking about clear ownership of the land and legal registration, etc. You then have various indicators that will apply to that criterion. This one, for example, comes from the UK Forest Standard and is reflected in UKWAS, because in the UK, UKWAS applies for both FSC and PEFC. And there's various things that an auditor would be expected to verify, and that's these bullet points here at the bottom, to meet that criteria as part of the audit. If we look at the same sort of situation in PEFC, this is in their meta standard. So in 1003, the standard requires that the organization shall comply with local, national, and international legislation. So if we, again, take this through to the national standard level, in Italy, we have this clause up here. In Denmark, for example, we have in section 5, the forest owner's responsibilities includes that they will comply with legislation as seen in Annex 1. And again, the auditor will assess that at audit. So here's an example of some of the things that an FM auditor will be checking, and this is true for both schemes, to look at legal compliance. So you have proof of legal entity and land ownership, proof of management plans, harvesting concessions or felling licenses, sales documents, so that's invoices, and proof of tax payments. You will also have in both schemes stakeholder consultation processes where you can have complaints and comments from stakeholders. So once the company has been through that process, or the forest owner, I should say, they can obtain a forest management certificate. And that means that they will be entered onto the public database of certificates. Both FSC and PEFC have one. They show the validity of that certificate, they show its scope. And in the case of forest management, you can also download the latest report to go and read that. So once it's certified, they can then supply material into the certified supply chain. So they harvest in their forest, and they can sell it into a sawmill, for example. Each scheme operates on a principle of certain details existing on sales documents. So when we say sales documents, we often mean invoices and delivery notes. There is the formal product claim, and then the certificate code that applies to that claim. And you can see two examples here. For FSC, FSC 100% is what will come out of a certified forest, likewise for PEFC. And these claims are quite specific, the wording of them. We'll get to that later on, but if, for example, this was written as 100% FSC certified, that is not a compliant claim, and the material cannot be considered as certified. On to chain of custody now. So you have a forest that's sold some certified logs to a sawmill. You then have the chain of custody in the supply chain that follows that material all the way through. So like I said, everybody who has legal ownership of that material, whether they process it or not, needs to hold a certificate and needs to pass that claim on for each sale. So the one comment on this is just a note that the way the schemes work does not mean that you have full traceability, log by log back to a forest. These schemes work on a kind of mass balance or volume balance basis, where you can track a given volume of certified material through, but you won't necessarily know its origin just through FSC or PEFC. That's not to say the processors couldn't implement that over and above, but it's not something that's required by the schemes. Let's take a look at one example of a link in this chain. So at every single link, you have a supplier, what we call an organization. So that's usually the certificate holder that we are auditing, and then their customer. And like I said, the status of this material remaining certified depends on the right details being passed on at this link in the chain. So the supplier will supply sales and delivery documentation with the relevant claim and code. The organization will check that, and they will then process it with the relevant controls in place, and they will make an appropriate claim with their certificate code onto their customer. And if any of those things don't happen, then the material can no longer be considered as certified. Like I said, this is a product level certification. So somebody can hold a certificate and still make uncertified sales. And it's also voluntary, so somebody can trade in timber without holding a certificate. You could even be sold certified timber without holding a certificate, but you obviously cannot make a claim when you then sell it on. So the chain of custody, you have the identification of your certified suppliers and their certified products coming in. You source that material from them. If necessary, depending on how your system works, you then segregate that or you process it appropriately. You record your changes of volume or weight. So again, that's that mass balance, volume balance principle. And you sell the certified material in the relevant volumes. So let's talk about the requirements of the chain of custody standards. So we're going back to do the same sort of thing as we did with FM. Both FSC and PEFC have global chain of custody standards that apply wherever you are in the world. One of the core requirements is that they have, each company has a quality management system in place. And you can see the various requirements, and this is not an exhaustive list of what the companies need to put in place. I'm going to talk now about the ones which are highlighted blue. So I'm going to talk about volume and conversion factors, because that's a very important thing in the system, and it's also something that really needs to be considered as part of your legality due diligence. And then I'm going to talk about how due diligence as a principle and a process is included within the PEFC scheme. So to support the mass balance, the volume balance through the system, each company that holds a certificate needs to maintain their accounting records, which is in effect the volume of material that they've bought, the volume that they've processed and sold, any volumes that they then hold in stock, and that can be verified by auditors at every link in the chain. That's one of the main things that we look at when we come to audit a company. So those accounting records, like I said, are going to include quantities. They're also going to include document references for those inputs and outputs. They're going to include the category and claim of the material. So you do have different levels of claims that need to be handled in different ways. Controlled wood is something that is FSC mixing in uncertified material, but checking that it's not got any controversial or unacceptable sources in it. And then the details which enable identification of certified products. So some companies will sell everything as certified, but if an invoice contains products which aren't certified and some which are, you need to be able to differentiate between those on those documents. One job of those accounting records is to show that when you take into account the conversion factor or the wastage, that the company has bought enough volume to produce the certified sales they claim to have been able to produce. And the company is responsible for tracking those conversion factors and justifying them to the auditor. Here's a few examples. Conversion factors vary wildly depending on the process, depending on the material, sometimes on the species, the products being made, etc. So it's worth considering this quite carefully, but there are some rules of thumb that you can use. So sawmilling, which is my background, you take a round log, you turn it into rectangles and squares of various sizes. So there's going to be some conversion there. There is no waste because everything that comes into a sawmill can be sold as either as timber or co-products. So I don't like to use the term wastage, but you definitely don't get the same volume of sawn timber out as you've put logs in. Depending on the size of logs being sawn, the species and the methodology for processing them, you're looking at something like 40% to 65%. It's also worth mentioning that most sawmills buy logs in tons and sell timber in volume, i.e. meters cubed. So you have to be quite careful with how you look at their numbers. A different process, so joinery, you might have factories which are taking wood that's already been through a sawmill. They are then performing a variety of processes on them, drilling, cutting, shaping, etc. Some of these will be tracked by computer systems and they will know exactly what they get out the other end. And some of them are going to be much more job specific. If you talk about bespoke, furniture joinery or one-off things like that, then it becomes a lot more difficult. A couple more examples. Charcoal. Charcoal, again, is extremely variable with the conversion factor. The rule of thumb is 3 to 5 tons of fresh wood to make 1 ton of charcoal, but that's going to depend on moisture content, on species, on the technology being used to produce the charcoal. You also have some products that are derived from charcoal which have other additives contained in them, such as fines or starch or resins and that kind of thing. So worth knowing exactly what's going on and assessing whether it's plausible or not. We then get to printing. So printing varies depending on the technology being used or the printing methodology. If you look at litho or litho printing, I'm never sure how to pronounce it, compared to digital, then the conversion factors are going to be very different. There will be significantly more trimming and test prints with litho printing compared to digital, for example. Most printers, particularly in the UK where I audit, most of the time are using software that tracks all of that so they can tell you exactly what their conversion factors are. Okay, alongside the accounting records that I've talked about, companies will have an overall summary for the year where they are summarizing the inputs, the production, any stock, and then outputs that they hold in stock or have sold. So all of that can be very useful, both from an auditor's perspective and from your perspective as people trying to perform due diligence on purchases to make sure that what you're being told makes sense. When it comes to due diligence as a process, It applies in FSC to controlled wood and introducing that to the supply chain, and it applies in PEFC to introducing PEFC controlled sources material into the supply chain. Both of those are examples of uncertified material being permitted to be mixed in to certified products to produce lower percentages mixed products. So PEFC has a universal due diligence requirement on all material in the supply chain, so whether you're sourcing it as certified or uncertified. And legality is reflected in that, with the first example of a controversial source, which is any activity or material that does not comply with local, national, or international legislation. So if I jump to the next slide, we have the steps of due diligence here. Gathering of information, you then risk assess based on that information. If you identify any risks in that risk assessment, you then need to mitigate for them. If you are sourcing only certified products in PEFC system, you only have to perform step 1 of this process. But for any products which you don't source as certified, so for any uncertified material that you want to mix in, you have to go through this whole process before you're able to introduce it to your supply chain. So certification as it relates to UKTR, which is obviously what we're all here for. Like Deanne and others have said, certification is not a green lane and will not become a green lane. There are numerous examples of illegal material entering certified supply chains, which have not been identified by audits. An example here is the Earthsight report on sanitary logging in Ukraine. And this was a few years ago. But if you go onto EIA or Earthsight or any of these organizations' websites, you can find reports that talk about that. So whenever you're looking at certification as a potential mitigation, it's worth bearing in mind all of these things that Deanne and others have said. A few points to think about or possibly to guide the discussion. An audit is always based on sampling. We cannot check everything. It would be unreasonable to ask us to do that and unreasonable to ask companies to show us everything. There's always a risk that something won't be spotted, as you saw in the last slide. Like I said before, being certified or a company holding a certificate doesn't mean that everything they sell is certified. It's a product level certification, so it has to contain that claim and all the right details on the sales documents. Certificates can be suspended and can also be terminated completely. That information is available on the public databases, so you need to be continually checking those to make sure that you have the right information up to date. And as Deanne said, certificates can remain valid even with major non-conformances, up to 5, and in some cases more than that potentially. So if possible, get the reports, find out what their current major, any non-conformances are, have they addressed them, how did they address them? And also the origin of controlled wood. So any uncertified material that has been mixed into those products. A mixed product or a product with a lower percentage is not necessarily has not all necessarily originated from a certified forest. On to the next one. There's a link here to the EU timber regulation, and there's similar available to the UKTR that explains how FSC in this example relates to EUTR, how it can work with it. And you also have issues in some supply chains where FSC has been used or attempted to be used as a mitigation on uncertified supply. So you have people using FSC certificates as mitigation or as evidence of conformance for material that was not supplied as certified. Okay, quick couple of slides here on high risk versus low risk, and then a couple of tips from me as an auditor. Forest level evidence of origin. we've already had a bit of a discussion with Deanne about whether that is needed or not for high risk and low risk countries. But like she said, ultimately, the legislation, so UKTR, asks operators to show that material is from a certain origin and that it is legal within that origin. So you might need to go a little bit further there. For high-risk countries, you want to go further on checking the authenticity of documents, so making sure that dates make sense. Any inconsistencies in scans, like Andy showed us earlier, so wonky digits or letters. Check the signatures. Google the official's name that's stamped at the bottom of the document. Make sure they were in post at the time. Make sure they've not been accused of corruption or that they've actually been convicted of corruption. Always worth translating documents, and make sure that those volumes all the way through the supply chain are consistent, that you actually have interrogated those conversion factors. Does that volume of logs into the sawmill make sense for the volume of product that I've bought from them, for example? And here's a few tips from me in terms of how to describe or use certification on your due diligence reports or system templates, however you present it. First of all, it might seem a bit obvious, but use certification as a mitigation when it's relevant. So was the material supplied as certified? And according to the sourcing hub or anyone else, is certification actually a relevant mitigation for what I'm trying to use it for? So make sure you've checked that the certificate was or still is valid, particularly that it was still valid at the time of the sale. Was the material actually delivered with a claim, a code, the right company name that matches the certificate, and the right address that matches the certificate? All of those details are available on the FSC and PEFC databases. You need to demonstrate that for each link. You need to, again, check those volumes and conversion factors and check those certificates the whole way through. If you present that to the auditor or to OPSS, the enforcement officer, then it's going to be a lot more obvious that you've done your homework on that front. And like I said, Sourcing Hub, NGO reports, all the other resources that Philippa mentioned will explain whether certification is useful in that country as a mitigation for certain risks. As a final comment, explain to your auditor or to your assessor which risk is being mitigated and present evidence of the above checks that I've just talked about. That's the presentation from me. So I think, are we going to any questions, Shah?
Thank you very much, Sam. Yes, a question from Simon. Would you please explain a bit more what would be a reasonable effort in ensuring the validity of the certification claim?
Yeah, of course.
Check.
So the standards require a minimum of at least annually. In practice, a lot of companies will do quarterly or 6 monthly, sometimes monthly. Ultimately, if you purchase material from somebody without a valid certificate at the time of the delivery, then it is not supplied as valid. So it's worth working with your suppliers to make sure that you know that their certificate is up to date, you know that it remains valid. It's obviously, for a lot of companies, too much to ask for every single delivery and every single order that you check every time. But some people do that because that's the way the scheme works. If the certificate is not valid at the time of supply, the stuff is not certified, ultimately.
Okay, thank you. And a question from me, if I may, Sam.
Yeah.
That sometimes certification is not really a relevant or useful mitigation measure. Could you give an example when that might be the case?
It can be hard to come up with examples off the top of my head, but I did have one the last time I did, last time we did this session, and I can't remember it. But yeah, I mean, it's certification covers the certified production of that company, the certified inputs, the production, and certified sales. It doesn't cover the fact that that company has, done everything right all of the time and that they're not doing other things on the side. It only applies to products which have been sourced as certified, and it only covers the things that are relevant to the standards, whether that's forest management or chain of custody. I think Andy and Sonia might have some good examples, so I'll let them shout just now.
Thank you, Sam. Andy?
Yeah. I mean, as Sam said, I mean, often certification certificates are waived as kind of, look, this company's certified, there's my mitigation. So the fact that the product isn't certified at all is commonly waved at us, and it actually no use whatsoever in terms of risk mitigation if the product isn't certified. But I think one of the best examples of thorough certification not addressing the legality risk in a specific context is Ukraine, in the sense that there's a lot of FSC certified forests in Ukraine and products coming out of there, and there has been issues about sanitary felling, that's been diseased trees taken out of the forest, and it's done in an overzealous fashion, and higher volumes of healthy trees taken out at the same time. But the bigger issue with Ukraine and certification not matching it is that the main legality risk in Ukraine was corrupt awarding of concession licenses, mainly by previous administrations. So Zelensky came into power in 2019. That's kind of off the top of my head. You'd want to search that more thoroughly. And there are a number of Ukrainian politicians kind of literally on the run, having disappeared with millions of dollars. So an FSC audit will not examine the risk of corruption in the awarding of the concession. If the company's got all the right paperwork to say it's got the concession and it's done it and they've practiced forest management correctly, then it'll be certified. Now, but potentially illegal because the awarding of the harvesting concession in the whole was done corruptly. Now, in the example of Ukraine, if you were to look at the Ukrainian risk assessment on the sourcing hub, you'll find a whole list of potential legality risks, lots of them around forest management practice, implementation of plans, health and safety, loads of different legality risks. Now, loads of those are mitigated by FSC certification. So an FSC or forest management audit will look at worker health and safety in the forest. It will look at management plans being followed, monitoring being conducted correctly, protection of high conservation values, all of these things that are in there as legality risks within the risk assessment for Ukraine. A lot of those are addressed by certification, but fundamentally, it doesn't look at political level corruption.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you, Andy. And Sonia, may I also have something to add?
Yes, it's sort of on a similar kind of vein. It can be really hard to have firm proof of illegality, which is why in the UKTR, the risk that what you're trying to do is mitigate the risk to negligible rather than no risk, because that's really hard to kind of have a 100% faith that something has no risk at all. So the Ukraine is a very extreme example of this, where there is proof that there was high levels of corruption in awarding felling licenses. But more broadly speaking, the limitations of FSC are that it is a voluntary certification scheme. It isn't kind of legally enforceable. So it cannot address issues which are systemic in a country. It cannot replace governance reforms that may be needed for legality to be kind of guaranteed in a country of origin. So it's important not to rely on certification alone. If you have access to any reports that there may be very high levels of corruption in a certain country, then you may want to do some more digging into specific individuals or into so yeah, basically it's very context dependent. There isn't really a way of making kind of black and white claims around this. And also just a sort of pet peeve issue of mine, and I think of probably the soil associations generally, is your factory being FSC certified doesn't really carry any weight at all in addressing your due diligence requirements. it is only the only thing a chain of custody certificate guarantees is that if you buy a product with a claim, it has originated in a FSC certified forest, as Sam was describing. So we see quite a lot of a lot of client originating pressure for factories to achieve chain of custody certification, but then not bothering to actually buy certified products. And that's just a massive waste of everybody's time. There's a lot of empty certificates around the world that have been issued because customers require their factories to be certified. But yeah, just gonna keep shouting about it.
Thank you, Sonia.
Yeah, that's my 5 cents. Thanks.
Yeah, that's very useful. So number 1, do not rely on certification. And number 2, do a little bit digging, maybe by just Google research, general internet research about the particular supplier or suppliers on the supply chain. And number 3, just bear in mind that in really high risk countries, certification patent is only one of the many things that you need to do when it comes to due diligence. Thank you. And a question from Brett. So third-party audit reports are easily found on FAC database, but not so much so on PFAC. So how to obtain those PFAC reports? Do we need to contact the PFAC suppliers? I think that's a very important question. Thank you, Brett. So earlier, Deanne mentioned, didn't she, that she would expect to see operators examining or downloading and checking the content of the FSC, COC and FM audit report to see if there's any bigger non-compliances. So from your auditor's perspective, so how would you like, or what would you expect to see during your audit?
So just
report. Yes.
First of all, I forgot to make that clear in the presentation. PEFC reports are available from the certification bodies, whereas the FSC reports are available from the database, the FSC database. That's true for forest management for both schemes. There's currently no requirement on certification bodies to publish chain of custody reports. But I would say that any reputable supplier, whether it's chain of custody or forest management, should be willing, more than willing, to share their chain of custody or FM audit report with you. If they've got something to hide, then they might not be, but hopefully they don't. So yeah, go and ask them if you can't find it elsewhere, and hopefully they're happy to share it with you. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry, Zhao, which you added?
Sorry, Sam. So Brett's question have been answered. The second part was from me, actually. So during your audit, what do you expect to see from operators? So if I'm the operator, if I just say in my report that I've downloaded FAC FM report, I've checked the report, there's not any major compliances found, all good. Will that be sufficient for you?
I think, yeah, that would be great. If the more explanation, the more context we can get, the better. You know, obviously the absolute bare minimum in terms of verifying certified status is checking that the certificate is valid and checking that the sales documents have the right details on them. But as Deanne and Andy and others have said, there can be non-conformances that could mean that certificate is no longer a valid mitigation for particular risks. So having a description in there of what you found in the report, whether there were any relevant non-conformances, or definitely a confirmation that there weren't any, and describing, you know, what you found in the report, or potentially even attaching the report as part of your due diligence and your supply chain map would be great. The more information, the better. The more information you put down, the less we will have to come and ask you for.
Just a quick one. I wonder, sorry, I saw Philippa raising her hand. I wonder whether there will be time tomorrow, maybe during your presentation tomorrow, to go through one example audit report of FSC, because I know FSC report can be very heavy, 100 pages long. So for anyone who doesn't really know about this, where to look, how to look for those non-conformances.
Yeah, I think Sonia's doing that tomorrow. So if she can find a couple minutes in the presentation, I'm sure she could show one. It's worth mentioning that every certification body has their own report template. There is no standardized reporting currently. although it might be on the way for FSC eventually. But yeah, so you will get used to reading different CB certification body reports. Ours is on Excel, for example. Others do it as a Word document or a PDF. There's a myriad of ways that it can be presented.
Yeah. Super.
Yeah, we can
Thank
bring
you.
some up and have a look at them tomorrow.
That'd be very useful. Thank you, Sam and Andy.
No, I was just going to say in the same note. So I had this problem the other day where one of our suppliers, so someone in the supply chain, had their PFC certificate terminated due to non-compliance. So in that case, I contacted the Malaysian Timber Certification Council and the PFC to see why they were terminated and if they can share information. And sometimes they can share it, but it's on a case-by-case basis. They can also email them as well.
That's a really good point. Each of the schemes has national offices or national bodies that administer the scheme in that country. And you can always go to them, go to the certification body, go to the international office to get help. Really good point, Philippa.
Very useful. Thank you. And then just to make a note here, so the TTF, we do generally have a good networking relationship with quite a few of those national bodies and local stakeholders. So if you ever need to contact any stakeholders in a particular country, and if you do not know who to contact, do let us know. Maybe we can help you to find the right contact for that particular country. Right. Thank you. Any further questions for our auditor? Oh, we have one from Eva. Hi, Eva. So the audit report is confidential document, yes, between the auditing body and the customer, and they may not wish to release it. Is that your position as well, so association? And would you object to COC?
I mean, within certification, the forest management audit reports, the certification requirements are the public summary is released and made available. And that's what's on the FSC database and on the certification body websites for PEFC. We publish the whole report. We don't summarise it. Just put the whole thing up there. Chain of custody audit reports are confidential and are between the certification body and their client. So whether you can obtain those is down to how much your supplier wants to keep you happy, I would imagine. I think the one example where a chain of custody audit report would be really relevant to legality would be when it's involves controlled wood. So that's where the product, a sawmill might be selling an FSC mix product, for example, or PFC mix product, and they're blending certified input material with uncertified controlled wood, which has been assessed for risk of illegality and various other things. But any findings, it's the forest verification part of that audit report is required to be publicly posted. So a chain of custody certificate holder that's sourcing controlled wood has in a non-low risk country. So in a high risk country, they need to complete a field verification audit of the sources of that controlled wood. That report has to be made publicly available and is available on the database. But if it's coming from a low-risk country, so if it's in the UK, there's no need for field verification because there's no risk of illegality from the uncertified material coming from the field.
Just to add to that, we do obviously have a confidentiality agreement with our clients that covers, us and the accreditation and the scheme owners and the client. But I don't think that would stop our clients, our certificate holders, sharing their own audit report with their customers if they wanted to. So yeah, it is confidential in some ways, but if the certificate holder is willing to share it, they are allowed to, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Andy. One more question from Simon. If our parent company provides us with the evidence they gathered for due diligence, EUTR DD, and we translated those documentations, will that be, or do we need to gather the documentations of ourselves all the way back to the suppliers?
So I'm not sure if this is similar to the previous question where the parent company was in Europe, so it had already been through EUTR and then it was coming under UKTR. But ultimately the obligation is on the operator, whether it's under EUTR or UKTR. If you have from your, or if your parent company has supplied you with all the information that you need to perform the risk assessment and come up with your conclusions and any risk mitigation, then that's fine. But you would still have to do that risk assessment and any mitigation, etc. And you would have to present it as the operator. As a generic example, if somebody else has gathered the information, if it's the right information, then that's great. The information gathering has been done, but the rest of the due diligence still needs to be done.
Yeah, you need to adopt what they've done, essentially.
Yes.
So if the parent company's done it already, typically, assuming that is sufficient and appropriate, you would need to look at it and just sign it off saying, yes, we've assessed this. We've got the same conclusions on the information provided, the risk identified, the mitigation part of it. So essentially adopting that's been done. You couldn't just present it as it stands, which evidence that you've engaged with it as an operator, fulfilling your own obligation.
Yep.
And just to add one thing here, so Simon, tomorrow Sonia will be sharing some examples of the presentation aspect of due diligence. So I think gathering of documentation is one thing. It's only a matter of how we translate or presenting or demonstrate those documentation onto this, you can call it report or summary or whatever. That is the first step. OPSS and auditors will be looking at. It is the summary presentation of your due diligence conclusions. Okay, hopefully that clarifies for now, and hopefully you can join us again tomorrow. Thank you, Simon. Anyone else for any other questions?
Please don't, I'm starving.
Okay, right,
tomorrow.
super. So yes, we will be back tomorrow at 10:30. Soil Association will be here, and we will also have two other companies joining us to share a bit more about their own experiences that include DHS panel products and Robbie from TradeLink. And also we will have Spot, BB Real and Open Timber Portal telling us about their free and very useful resources. So hopefully we will see everyone back again tomorrow. Thanks again for your time today. Have a good afternoon. And thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Sonia, Philippa. Bye.